Welcome to this presentation on developing a risk mentality. My name is David Shaw. I'm a project management professional and also a professional in critical infrastructure protection, which means I know how to do a security assessment of your premises. For the last 10 years, I have been specializing in cloud strategy, cloud operations, and cloud security models for both AWS and Azure. I've been incorporating risk management in my work for at least 20 years. Originally, I started with training in threat risk assessment using a harmonized methodology developed by CSIS and the RCMP. This presentation is an excerpt from a one-day seminar, so I will be touching on just a few points. I've updated it to include some current risk events. The purpose is to help you develop a risk mentality, introduce some basic risk assessment processes, and demonstrate the use of PI scores in risk assessments. Many of you have probably been involved in writing proposals or project plans, where you list dependencies, constraints, assumptions, risks, and so forth. Often this is as far as it goes for risk management. Or maybe you are data-driven and you're monitoring metrics on a project as a form of risk management. The problem with metrics is that these tell us when something has already gone wrong. As a project manager, you should have a risk mentality, meaning that you should have broad situational awareness. You should be sensitive to bat signals based on your experience. Let's take the Boeing Starliner as an example. At the moment, it is stranded at the International Space Station after its first crewed mission. Briefly, the project was 6 years late due to many production and quality control issues. At the time of launch on June 5, 2024, it had a helium leak. Based on data, the engineers decided it was safe to launch because the leak was small and there were tons of helium on board. By the time Starliner reached the space station, there were 5 leaks and several thrusters had failed. Now, NASA and Boeing say the Starliner is safe to return to Earth anytime, but just not right now. After weeks of testing in space, some 30 defects have been identified. Yes, the data said it was safe to launch, but given the history of quality control problems, the engineers should have been sensitive to the bat signal of the original helium leak. They should not have launched, but this would have put the project at risk of cancellation. Political, reputational, and financial concerns dictated it had to go. Now, political, reputational, and financial concerns are keeping NASA from asking Elon Musk's SpaceX Dragon spacecraft from mounting a rescue flight. If they ask SpaceX to bring back the astronauts, the Starliner project is dead. If they bring them back in Starliner and there is a disaster, the project and more is dead. Either way, all the project engineers lose their jobs. Many large projects suffer from these same concerns, but signals are ignored and risks compound into a potential disaster. We all have some sense of risk. You may be familiar with childproofing a home or some other precautions you have taken in life. For example, we don't leave a boiling pot of water where a child can reach it, or encourage a teenager to experiment with substances. Similarly, on projects, we should be providing guardrails and best practices to guide team members. So what is a risk? A risk is an uncertain event that threatens a capability to meet objectives within certain constraints. Note the emphasis on uncertain event. It is something we know, but it may or may not happen. It might rain at the barbecue, but then it might not. Note also that the PMBOK defines risks as both negative and positive events. For this presentation, we will define risks as negative events. So a risk is the stuff that could mess you up, and instead of hoping it won't happen, we should plan to avoid it. To develop risk awareness, it's useful to study disasters. Disasters are usually the result of compound risks. Take the Titanic. The data said Titanic was unsinkable. It was a marvel of engineering. There were several contributing risk factors in its sinking, but let's consider just two. First, it was unsinkable, so on its maiden voyage, the captain was driving it hard in an ice field to reach New York in quick time. Second, the bulkheads were not truly watertight. They did not extend fully to the main deck. So when it hit the iceberg and holed the hull, water filled one compartment and then flowed over the top of the bulkhead into the next compartment, and so on. The Titanic had a sister ship, the Britannic. The data said Britannic was super safe. It was built to rectify all the defects Titanic had. The bulkheads were truly watertight, for example. Yet it sank faster than the Titanic. It was being used as a hospital ship in World War I. Back then there were no antibiotics, so the casualty wards were filled with soldiers who had festering and foul-smelling wounds. Next, the stokers who shoveled coal into the boilers were berthed at the opposite end of the ship. So it was standard operating procedure when there was a shift change to open the watertight doors so the stokers could quickly run back and forth to their positions. On the medical wards, it was also standard operating procedure to open the portholes every morning to air out the stink. That's when a torpedo struck. Open watertight doors and open portholes. An unexpected combination of events. Oh dear, a blue screen of death. The recent global IT meltdown on July 19th of 8.5 million Windows computers is another example of compound risk vectors. The root cause of this disaster is that in a 2003 settlement to increase competition, the EU forced Microsoft to open access to the kernel in its operating system. No other operating system has an open kernel. Then, at least 120,000 global organizations with sophisticated IT departments decided it was a good idea to install CloudStrke's AI-enhanced cybersecurity protection as a low-level bootstart driver in the core Windows kernel. Bootstart means it must be present to load Windows. This should have raised eyebrows somewhere. These organizations also allowed the driver to be updated automatically. This is considered good practice today to keep systems secure with the latest versions and patches. Organizations cannot afford the cost of managing updates themselves, but this means you don't have oversight on configuration management. Many of these security-conscious organizations also installed Windows BitLocker. This encrypts the hard drive to protect data. Next, CloudStrke obviously failed to test the update adequately. This is hard to understand considering the driver was bootstart. Test systems should not have started. Then CloudStrke did not deploy with a canary in the mine strategy. With a canary strategy, a change is rolled out to a small number of customers, and you wait to see if there are issues. If there are, those customers are rolled back to a previous version. If there are no issues, the update is deployed to another set of customers, and so forth. But in this case, customers could not be rolled back to a previous version because the update bricked the computers with a blue screen of death. In the best case, there are manual workarounds like booting in safe mode, but this doesn't work if the organization has mandated the use of BitLocker to encrypt hard drives. Don't forget, the root cause of this fiasco was a policy decision by technocrats in the EU. A risk is not a red light event. A red light event is completely outside our control. There's nothing we can do if someone runs a red light and it T-bones us. Also, a risk is not a problem, difficulty, worry, whinge, or gripe. As mentioned earlier, we all manage risks in our lives as we follow a risk management strategy. We can take action to avoid the risk happening. We can accept the risk and its consequences. We can mitigate the risk to lessen its impact. Or we can transfer the risk to another party through insurance, warranties, guarantees, and the like. Project risks are found in dependencies, uncertainty, constraints, and assumptions. For example, we depend on the general contractor to pass on to the plumber our requirements and toilet fixtures. Can we get a roofer who won't set the shingles on fire? The car must be fixed before our weekend trip. The electrician left a hole in the wall. Will he fix it? Common dependencies can be found in linked tasks and events like holidays that might affect release dates. Obvious dependencies are the availability and performance of related systems and the facilities that support them. Resources like tools, standards, personnel are sources of dependencies, as well as cross-team or matrix team scheduling and communication. External dependencies can be found in suppliers, transportation, the internet, and so forth. There are many common causes of uncertainty. A few that arise in most projects are the scope of work, changes in requirements, and scope creep. Estimates are often unreliable, especially in agile projects with its small, medium, and large units of work. Common sources of constraints are the familiar scope, time, and cost, the previously mentioned requirements, resources, and external dependencies. As mentioned in the Starliner example, internal and external politics can also be a factor. Common assumptions arise out of things we believe to be true. Two very common ones are belief that we will be able to find competent staff, and they will be available at a reasonable cost, and senior management will make the technology investment for the systems we need. Another one is avoidance or procrastination. You know what happens when you put off a difficult discussion with your partner, waiting for the best time. The best time never comes, and the issue compounds. Effective risk management follows a risk management strategy like previously mentioned: accept, avoid, mitigate, transfer. The goal is to minimize the uncertainty by reducing the probability that something will occur, and to take steps to mitigate the potential effect in a way that will reduce the impact to an acceptable level if it occurs. There are many barriers to risk management. Some are listed here. I've already alluded to some reasons why risk management is often not done. Here are some examples of how organizations discourage a risk awareness mentality or attitude. Recently, I developed a contingency plan for a multi-cloud application that spanned AWS and Azure. It included a risk analysis and ranking section. I scheduled a review meeting with 2 directors and several senior project managers. They told me that they did not analyze and rank risks, they just listed them, and I should remove that section of the report. Since the senior director had to accept and sign off on the report, I removed the section but wrote a footnote that risk analysis and ranking had not been done. In another case, I was doing a threat risk assessment for a data center in Texas. I identified climate change, especially extreme weather events and insect migrations, as risks. The president would not accept the report until I removed all mention of climate factors. 2 years later, his data center flooded out in an extreme rainstorm. A lack of time is sometimes used as an excuse. In many organizations, gated projects have a heavy documentation overhead, and you might feel like you don't have the time for risk management. It is seen as a burden, keeping you from doing the real work. But it's more efficient to prevent problems than fix them after they occur. Or perhaps you feel that if you identify a risk, you will have to address it, and you won't have the time for that. Again, it's better to prevent problems than it is to fix them afterwards. Many organizations discourage bad news, contrary opinions, or dissent. It seems to be a characteristic of our times. A principle of quality management is to eradicate fear in an organization. If staff cannot be honest and management is not transparent, problems will percolate beneath the surface and risk the success of the project. For the last decade or so, we have had a cancel culture in the West, in which some information and individuals are not allowed to be heard. Shooting the message has become commonplace as people go along to get along. This is prevalent in organizations that are very political in their management style. This is not new. Years ago, it was common to say, "If you can't bring me a solution, then you are part of the problem." This was supposed to be smart, but it was idiotic, yet it was widely held as a truism. As just mentioned, organizations committed to continuous improvement should eradicate fear and promote transparency so people can speak the truth. Risk management can become a bureaucracy. It's not unusual for risk management to become a sub-project with its own very detailed risk management plan. I've seen plans that are more than 60 pages. In government, I've seen risk assessments that take a year to do. Ideally, risk management should be an inherent part of project management. It should follow the lean principle of shift left, like we find in DevOps and security by design. Risk management should become part of your thought process in managing projects. You may still need some formal risk management processes, but keep them as lean as possible. When risk management is not part of the culture, it can be seen as just another management fad. A lot of organizations just want to check the box to get through a project date. Yes, we did risk management. Check. But remember that managing risk is the foundation of good project management. Leverage existing organizational processes to your advantage and customize them for your project. You might think you know the risks. As mentioned earlier, sometimes risks are just listed in a proposal or a project plan and then forgotten. But recall the example of the Starliner, where a small risk at the start became a complex compound risk at the end. As the project progresses, the probability and impact of a risk can change. New risks can emerge. Recall that risks arise from dependencies, uncertainty, constraints, and assumptions. Generally, most project risks will change in the area of dependencies and assumptions. Dependencies are subject to change that might be outside our control. Assumptions can turn out to be false. In agile projects, risks can change in constraints on cost and schedule. None of us want to feel stupid in public. Also, we live in a climate of canceling dissent and self-censorship. Usually when you're afraid to raise issues, it's because management shoots the messenger. This can happen in any organization where decision-making is hierarchical. Your immediate supervisor might be open and transparent, but they may be operating in a very political environment with middle and senior management. Recall the previous examples I gave of management requesting some findings be removed from reports. There are worse cases. In this situation, you might be able to socialize issues horizontally before presenting them. Consult with your teammates to see what they think. Try to be fact or data driven and avoid any emotional commitment in the outcome. Be respectful and gracious. Now let's turn to risk identification. In identifying risks, there are methods to search for risks which we then state in a standard syntax to facilitate analysis. We then document this in some sort of risk log or registry. Because this is an excerpt from a larger workshop, here we will focus only on stating the risk in a standard syntax, followed by risk classification and analysis. As just mentioned, risk statements in a standard syntax form the basis for analysis. A statement contains a condition with its probability and the consequences with its impact. It is constructed with an if-then syntax. Let's look at an example. On our project, we might identify communications as a risk, but we haven't quantified it in any way. What is the probability of this risk occurring? What are the consequences if it does? Without knowing this, we can't analyze the risk. Here is a better risk statement. It expresses the probability and contains a condition, but it doesn't have a consequence. Here is a good risk statement. If we fail is a probability. To communicate about service levels is a condition. Then additional effort will be required is the impact. And misunderstandings is the consequence. Some risks may be compounded by other risks. Earlier we looked at the examples of compound conditions in the Titanic, Britannic, Starliner, and Windows situations. It is a combination of the conditions that creates the risk. For a recent example, look into the epic fail of the American Secret Service at the recent attempt to kill Donald Trump on July 13th. It would be a good homework exercise for you to use public reports to identify the compound risk factors that led to this event. So after we have identified and stated the risks in a standard syntax, we can proceed to analyze the risks. We analyze risks by classifying them, merging similar risks, assessing the value, and then prioritizing the risks for action. We classify risks based on type, area, and group. Because we have used a standard syntax, it is easy to search for similar or duplicate risks. We assess the value using probability and impact. Finally, we can prioritize risks based on probability and impact PI scores, and we will see how to do that shortly. We usually classify risks by types, areas, and groups to identify clusters for analysis. Types are underlying drivers like cost, schedule, and performance. Areas are the work breakdown, and groups are specific themes such as email and cybersecurity. Risk statements help people agree on risks. Search through types, areas, groups, and managers to find similarities and merge risks. Look for overlaps and merge only if appropriate. After merging risks, we can prioritize them using probability and impact. There are several ways you can rank them. Some common ways are ranking them by raw PI scores. I will explain PI scores in a moment. Or you might want to rank them within cost, schedule, or performance, or as a combined score. We can analyze risks by assessing probability and impact. This is not a science. At best, it is semi-quantitative, so expert judgment is also needed. Assess the probability based on the likelihood of the risk occurring if no preventative action is taken. Remember, we can accept a risk, avoid a risk, mitigate a risk, or transfer a risk. Often you can find statistics to assess the likelihood. When was the last flood? How often does it flood? For example, Toronto was flooded on July 16th. The previous flood event was 11 years ago. Let's look at some data. Here is some data on severe rainstorms in Toronto and the intervals between them. The last two caused floods, but have no information on the others. If you were doing a cost-benefit analysis to compare the cost of reparations versus the cost of improving infrastructure, which data points would you use? Let's do a thought experiment. The average interval over 181 years of records is 16 years. The longest is 39 years, and the shortest is 4 years. The median is 14.5 years. What interval would you use in a cost-benefit analysis? You might think to ask AI. If you ask AI, it will tell you, due to the sequence's lack of a clear pattern, a sensible approach is to make an educated guess based on known data if no other information is available. The PMBOK would call this expert opinion. If we remove the outliers of 39, 35, and 33 years, we get an average of 9 years. Does this seem reasonable? What about the run from 1948 to 1962, when there was an interval of 4, 6, and 8 years? This is an average of 6 years. If we had a run of 3 years today, the impact on the city would be tremendous. So perhaps we could justify an analysis that used a range of 6 to 9 years. Can we support this argument? If we look for more information, according to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the Greater Toronto Area has had 6 100-year storms since 2005. This is an average interval of 3 years. However, the downfall was not as widespread as in the severe storms. The shorter the interval, the more imperative it is to avoid the cost of the damage and to mitigate the risk by investing in infrastructure to prevent the loss. The point is that in any analysis, you must be able to show the sources of your data and the steps you took in arriving at the result. And as AI said, this is an educated guess. After assessing the probability, you can also quantify the impact. What would be the cost to recover if the risk occurs? What is the impact of a delay in schedule? Will there be lost revenue or additional costs? Will the deliverable be less performant? And how will that affect us? Now let's look at two ways of using the PI scoring system. After we identify the probability and impact, we can use PI scores to compare individual risks, define the most important risks, and assess total risk on a project. A PI score is simply the result of multiplying together the probability and impact using the 5-point scale. A 3-point scale lacks sufficient granularity to prioritize risks. In the PI scoring system, we associate scores with a defined scale of very low, low, medium, high, and very high. Each score is assigned a numerical value. Impact is more important. For example, high probability and low impact means we will survive. Low probability and a very high impact means we may not survive. So we use a logarithmic scale for impact and a linear one for probability. Using a logarithmic scale is similar to what we do in Agile, when we use small, medium, and large for estimating. A simple way of using PI scores is to plot the risks in a matrix. Using the numerical values previously established, we can plot all possible results. A risk scoring less than 10, shown in green, is a low risk. A risk scoring 10 to 20, shown in orange, is a medium risk. A risk scoring greater than 20, shown in red, is a high risk. If we use the recent rainstorm as an example, we can plot various results to help us understand the scope of the risk. I think we can agree the impact of the storm was high or very high. It certainly was not a medium event. I think we can also agree that the probability is higher than low. So here's a plot of high impact and a range of probability from very high to medium. Here is a plot of very high impact and a range of probability from very high to medium. In both cases, you can clearly see that we need to take action to mitigate the risk. Another way of analysis is to use cumulative PI scores and the 80-20 rule. To use cumulative 80-20, we first rank risks by their PI score from highest to lowest. In real life, of course, there would be a longer list of risks than shown here. Next, we calculate the cumulative score. For example, 7.2 plus 5.6 is 12.8, and 12.8 plus 4 is 16.8, and so on. Now we need to normalize the scores. To normalize the scores, we set the highest cumulative score to equal 1 or 100%. Then we can normalize each ranking as a percentage of the highest ranking. The 7.2 divided by 25.6 gives us 28%. Each cumulative score is converted to a percentage of the total score. Now we can use the 80-20 rule to identify 80% of the risk in our project. Using the 80-20 rule, we can see that risks 1 through 4 comprise the majority of risks, and we can focus on these for action. Finally, you should use expert opinion to review the rankings. Remember that this is a semi-quantitative process. Review the ranked list to see if A is really a higher risk than B. If an expert review disagrees, change the ranking to reflect your concerns. This brings us to the end of this presentation. I hope you have a better sense of risk awareness and understand several ways you can use PI scores. Thank you for your interest. If you have any follow-up questions, please contact me by email at david.shaw@cloudgovco.com or scan the QR code. I am on LinkedIn, but honestly, I'm not very active on social media. Also, you should be able to find this presentation on YouTube. Again, thank you.